Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Okay, so World War II is over, right? Now we're going to get into the post-war politics and events that happen after World War II regarding Europe, the Soviet Union, as well as part of the United States. So let's go ahead and rock and roll. Post-war politics, 1945 to 1948. All right, so here's what we have first, right? So at the end of World War II, you have European leaders like Churchill and Stalin getting together with Franklin Roosevelt, and later you'll see Harry Truman. But they're getting together to figure out what they're going to do with post-war Europe. In the European theater, ending in May of 1945. Prior to that, you have what we call the Yalta Conference, and that's when the big three, that's what we call those three right there in that picture, the big three, when they get together to discuss Europe's future. The Yalta Conference is like, hey, what are we going to do with post-World War II Europe? Okay, what's going to happen in Europe after World War II? And in July of 1945, we have the Potsdam Conference. Now, if you remember the Potsdam Conference, that was the conference that we reviewed at the end of World War II when we said it told Japan to surrender. Hey, Japan, if you don't surrender, you're going to be met with harsh circumstances. And they don't surrender, and we drop the atomic bombs, right? But other things happened at the Potsdam Conference. The big one here that we're looking at is these Allied leaders took Germany and they divided it in four. Not only did they take Germany and divide it in four, they took Berlin, the capital, and divided it in four. So if you look at the picture right there on the center of your screen to the left, you'll see you have red, which is the Soviet Union, green, which is Britain, yellow, which is the United States, and blue, which is France. Now, if you look in the center of that red area, you'll see a little dot that has the same colors, red, green, blue, and yellow. That is Berlin. That's the capital of Germany. Now, what's the problem? Well, after World War II, Germany's divided in two, East Germany and West Germany. Now, what we have on this picture here is you see East Germany is all red, Soviet Union. That means it's a communistic country. However, on the West, you have a more Western-style capitalistic country in Western Germany. Now, what's the problem? In Berlin, you will have, again, the three capitalistic parts of the city and one communistic parts of the city, and that's where we get the Berlin Wall. The infamous Berlin Wall is built between East and West Berlin. It becomes what we know as like a metaphor of the Cold War. You want to know about the Cold War, communism, capitalism? The Berlin Wall that separates East and West Berlin. And we covered the Nuremberg trials, but just to remind you, at the end of 45, beginning of 46, high-ranking Nazi officials are tried and some sentenced to death for their wartime activities. All right, so that's what's going on in politics in Europe, and what they're trying to do with Europe and Germany after the war is over. If you remember, at the end of World War I, we create the League of Nations. However, we don't join the League of Nations. Remember that whole thing that where these nations got together and were like, hey, let's go ahead and create an organization where we'll prevent further wars. Well, that never happened for the United States. It happened, but not for us. We never joined it. However, the United Nations comes out of the end of World War II. You see, in 1944, these allied nations met to discuss the United Nations. Like, what are we going to do? This organization dedicated to resolving or kind of policing international conflicts. So if something internationally would happen, you would have a whole group of nations who were like, no, 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 you can't do that. And in 1945, representatives from 50 countries come to Washington, D.C. and write the charter for the United Nations. One of its first major acts as the United Nations is it tries to separate the Arab and the Jewish states in the Middle East. And in 1948, Jewish leaders announced the creation of a new country. So Jewish leaders create Israel as a place where survivors of the Holocaust were to live. All right, so that's the United Nations. So now we have what's going on with Europe, and now we have what can we do to prevent further wars. However, we don't stop all wars, and here's what I mean by that. After World War II is over, you have to remember, you have the United States, Britain, France, you have Western style governments, United States capitalistic government, and you have the Russians or the Soviets who lead with a communistic regime, a harsh communistic regime. Capitalism and democracy, that's all about America. The Soviets are communists. Everything is for the good of the government. Everything is shared. And what's going on here is while the Soviet Union or Russia is moving west during the war, moving into Germany to help end World War II, they are taking over these countries like Poland, eventually like Czechoslovakia. They're moving into all these different Slavic countries in Eastern Europe. And while they are moving through, they are implementing their communistic regime. So Stalin is making all these Eastern European countries communist. Well, the Americans and the British, like Winston Churchill, are like, we cannot have this because, you know, Stalin is just doing what Hitler was doing. He's forcing his government on other nations and controlling them. Winston Churchill actually called the divide between communistic countries and capitalistic or Western style countries the Iron Curtain. And if you look at this picture right here, you have a cartoon in the middle and you have a map on the bottom. That line that divides that red and blue, that was what we called like the Iron Curtain. This Iron Curtain was metaphorical. It wasn't an actual curtain. And it was the idea to divide the communistic countries from all the other countries in the world. All right. So like I said, Stalin has been pushing his communism on all these Eastern countries. And remember when we talked about earlier about Berlin being inside of Soviet controlled Eastern Germany, Stalin was like, I want all of Germany and I'm going to push this to the limit. So he actually closes off all roads into Western Germany, hoping that, you know, like the United States and Britain would be like, oh, well, we want to avoid another war, so we're just going to give it to Stalin. However, because the world was afraid of the spread of communism, we have what we call the Berlin airlift. And what happened was Truman and Churchill got together and they're like, listen, we are not going to let Stalin go ahead and take this land. We are going to put our foot down. We are going to show him that we mean business. And literally, they flew thousands upon thousands of missions over Berlin, dropping supplies in to aid the people in West Berlin. This is what we call the Berlin airlift. What we have going on now between Stalin and the communist Soviet Union and the Americans and the British, what we have here is what this is called the Cold War. This is the struggle for global power between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it lasts for about 45 years. All right. The United States plan to deal with communism is called containment. Just like you put a whole bunch of marbles in a bowl, you try to contain them. You are not going to go to war to go ahead and fight communism. You are going to do whatever you can to just contain it, stop it from spreading. A couple of these bullet points on your screen describe how we try to contain it. The Truman Doctrine is a policy of providing aid to European countries to help foreign countries fight communism. Greece and Turkey, Truman gave money to them to sit there and say, hey, use this money. Remember who gave it to you, the Americans, and, you know, fight against communism. The Marshall Plan was a plan where Western European countries received $17 billion to help rebuild and push away communist influence. In order to show Stalin that this was not a wartime aiding effort, it was a humanitarian effort. We're going to go ahead and give you this money to help you rebuild your cities and rebuild your economy. But again, remember who gave it to you, the United States. So if Stalin goes in there and tries to take over, you tell him no, no, no. The Allied powers also signed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. United States, Canada, Iceland, and several Western European countries signed this NATO organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was like this: hey, you know, if some communistic power attacks us, we will then go ahead and get together and we will attack that communistic power. Stalin sees this and he's like, well, guess what, guys? So you have your NATO, I have my Warsaw Pact. This is to say that all communistic countries are going to go ahead and back us up if your countries attack us. So now you have the Western style West, you have the communistic East, and we just keep building and building and building. All right. African Americans and women are told to give up their jobs in the United States. African American veterans face segregation and prejudice at home, which promotes a major effort to gain civil rights. So not only do you have trying to figure out what's going on in Europe, you have now we're fighting a Cold War politically, and at home we have to try to figure out what we are going to do with the segregation issue in the United States, right? So President Truman appoints a committee of civil rights to investigate discrimination and suggest solutions, but they fail to do anything. Truman is a big guy on civil rights. He supports civil rights. And the government and many Democrats in the South actually oppose Truman's civil rights efforts. So Truman tried to take steps into his own hands, and you see by the newspaper there in 48, Truman issues Executive Order 9981, which ends segregation in the armed forces, which means now, like the Tuskegee Airmen, who used to have to fly into separate bases, can now fly into regular desegregated bases. Then now remember, Congress cannot cancel an executive order, but they can cut funding to it, and they did. In 1948, Harry Truman wins the presidency despite lots of opposition. Like I said, his Southern Democrats opposed to civil rights. Republicans felt that Thomas Dewey could beat Truman. You see a very famous picture. Dewey defeats Truman, taken the night before the election results were posted. Truman actually wins. He takes his case of re-election to the American people. He's traveling on train, going to see a lot of people, traveling thousands of miles to say, hey, it's like a really good case of politicking, getting yourself out there. He urges Congress to support his plan, and the Fair Deal has a lot of things in it that has to do with civil rights and economics. So Congress approved parts including a higher minimum wage, expanded Social Security benefits, but they do reject a lot of the civil rights legislation. So here is post-war politics in America, right? And in Europe. We have the European theater. We now are entering a new Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we are trying to fight against segregation in the United States.